Warning: this episode contains strong language, uncomfortable truths, and direct criticism of media institutions and public narratives. Listener discretion is advised, not because this is reckless, but because truth tends to sting when it's no longer filtered.
There was a time when journalists stood between the public and the chaos. Observers, record keepers, witnesses to history. That line is gone now. Tonight, the people holding the cameras aren't just documenting the story. They're inside it, chanting, marching, signaling, and shaping the very events they'll later narrate as news. When the person telling you what happened is also helping decide how it happens, facts don't just get distorted, they get weaponized. This isn't about left versus right. This is about what happens when the referee puts on a jersey and still insists the game is fair. Because when journalism becomes activism, misinformation doesn't just spread, it escalates. Welcome to Data and Dissonance, where we speak truth and stir thought. All right, let's bring in the crew, because this is one of those conversations where how you see the world matters just as much as what you're being shown. First up, Brian, our resident MAGA firebrand, permanently allergic to media spin, and always ready to ask why the same behavior is journalism on Monday and extremism on Tuesday. Next, Rachel, the independent voice in the room, cutting through the noise, calling balls and strikes, and usually the first one to say, "Hold on, that doesn't add up." Then there's Daniel, our conspiracy realist, pattern spotter, and professional red thread puller, here to connect dots the headlines pretend don't exist. And rounding it out, Skylar, bringing the progressive lens, pushing back where she sees bias, and making sure this conversation doesn't turn into an echo chamber. I'm Artie, and tonight we're asking a simple but dangerous question. When journalists stop observing and start participating, who's left to tell the truth? Let's get into it. All right, let's set the table for this, because what we're talking about tonight isn't some isolated oops moment or a single reporter getting a little too close to the action. Over the last few weeks, we've seen journalists chanting, marching, coordinating, and participating in protests they're supposedly covering, wearing press credentials while doing it, then turning around and reporting on the very chaos they helped amplify. And when people noticed, when the footage surfaced, the response wasn't accountability. It was silence, excuses, or outright defense. This matters because journalism is supposed to be the buffer between emotion and reality. It's supposed to slow things down, add context, and separate facts from narrative. But when reporters stop being witnesses and start becoming actors, that buffer disappears, and what replaces it is escalation dressed up as news. So the question we're starting with tonight is simple, but it's uncomfortable, and it cuts straight to the credibility crisis we're living in. At what point does covering the story become actively shaping it, and should anyone trust the coverage once that line is crossed? Brian, let me start with you.
All right, let's stop pretending this is complicated, because it's not. Journalism used to be watch, verify, report. What we're seeing now is participate, provoke, then lecture the audience about what they're seeing. When you've got reporters chanting slogans, marching in the crowd, signaling where cameras are, or conveniently turning away right before things go sideways, you're not documenting reality anymore. You're manufacturing it. And then they have the nerve to look straight into the camera afterward and say, "Here's what happened," as if they weren't just elbow deep in the moment 5 minutes earlier. And here's the part that really fries me. If a conservative reporter so much as smiled at a cop while covering a protest, they'd be fired, blacklisted, and labeled propaganda by sunset. But when a progressive reporter is shoulder to shoulder with activists, chanting along, suddenly it's immersive journalism, or bearing witness. No, and that's called activism with a press badge. And the badge is doing all the work. It gives cover, it gives credibility, and it gives permission for escalation, because the crowd knows the story's already going to be framed in their favor. This is how you end up with headlines that say, "mostly peaceful," while buildings burn off camera, or "unprovoked response," while the full footage shows exactly who threw the first punch. And once the public realizes the referee is wearing a team jersey, the game's over. People stop trusting the score, stop trusting the rules, and eventually stop trusting each other. That's not just bad journalism. That's how misinformation stops being abstract and starts getting people hurt. Artie, this isn't a media mistake anymore. It's a business model. Artie, your turn. Because if the media is no longer even pretending to be neutral, what does that do to the people on the receiving end of these stories?
Yeah, and that's the part people keep glossing over, Brian. The human cost of this shift. Because when the media stops pretending to be neutral, it doesn't just change headlines, it changes behavior. Protesters feel morally insulated because they know the cameras are friendly. Officers feel boxed in because they know context will be stripped. And regular people watching at home are being trained night after night to see one group as righteous by default and the other as guilty on sight. That's not journalism informing the public, that's narrative pressure shaping outcomes in real time. And the irony is the media still wants all the trust, all the authority, all the credibility of being the fourth estate, while acting like a political action committee with press passes. You don't get to light the fuse, walk away, and then report on the explosion like you were just a bystander. At some point, accountability has to apply upstream, not just to the people caught in the blast radius. So let me toss this to Rachel, because you tend to live in that uncomfortable middle ground where you're skeptical of power and skeptical of mob mentality. Rachel, when viewers realize reporters aren't just covering protests, but actively participating in them, does that permanently damage public trust? Or do you think audiences have already adjusted to the idea that news is just another form of activism now?
I think the damage is already done. The audience has adjusted. And that's actually the scariest part. We didn't just lose trust in the media overnight. We slowly lowered our expectations until people started watching the news the same way they watch opinion podcasts, assuming bias, filtering everything, and bracing for spin. When viewers expect activism instead of accuracy, truth doesn't just get buried, it becomes optional. And once that happens, facts stop being a shared foundation and turn into ammo for whichever side shouts the loudest. What really bothers me is how casually this line crossing is defended. Journalists are humans too, sure, but so are judges, and we still expect them not to march with one side of a case. The moment a reporter chants, marches, or signals allegiance, they've told the audience who they're protecting. And it's not the truth. Even if they report something factually correct later, the credibility is already compromised because the intent is in question. And intent matters more than ever when tensions are this high. And to Brian's point, this doesn't just warp coverage, it warps reality. When crowds believe the press is on their side, escalation feels justified. When law enforcement knows context will be stripped, hesitation turns into danger. The media isn't just reflecting the temperature anymore, it's turning the thermostat. That's not a role anyone consented to, and it's not something audiences can just get used to without serious consequences. Artie, if this is the new normal, if activism and journalism are now openly blended, how does the public tell the difference between reporting, propaganda, and outright manipulation anymore?
That question right there, Rachel, that's the fracture. Because once people can't tell the difference between reporting and propaganda, they stop asking, is this true? And start asking, who is this for? And that's a brutal shift. Truth becomes secondary to alignment. Accuracy gets replaced by usefulness. And the media doesn't even have to lie outright anymore. It just has to frame selectively, omit context, and trust that the audience will fill in the blanks with whatever emotion they were primed with beforehand. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. This doesn't just radicalize one side, it radicalizes everyone. People who feel misrepresented dig in harder. People who feel validated escalate faster. Moderates either disengage completely or get dragged into fights they never signed up for. When the press abandons its role as a stabilizer, it becomes an accelerant. And accelerants don't get to act shocked when things catch fire. So let's pull on the thread a little harder, because this isn't random. Patterns like this don't just emerge out of nowhere. Daniel, you're the guy who looks at incentives, patterns, and who benefits when norms quietly collapse. Is this just cultural rot and bad journalism? Or is there something more deliberate going on when media figures cross from observing events into actively shaping them?
Yeah, this isn't accidental, and it's definitely not just bad journalism. What you're looking at is incentive alignment, not incompetence. When reporters step into protests instead of standing back from them, it's because participation pays. Outrage pays, access pays. Being seen as on the right side of history pays, in clicks, in grants, in foundation money, in platform protection. Neutrality doesn't trend, conflict does. And once you understand that, the behavior suddenly makes a lot more sense. Think about it. If you're a journalist embedded with activists, you're not just covering a story, You're securing future access. You're getting the chance, the interviews, the emotional moments, the viral clips, and in return, you frame the narrative in a way that keeps those relationships intact. That's not reporting, that's symbiosis. The press gives legitimacy, the movement gives relevance, and the public gets a carefully curated version of reality that just happens to escalate tensions every single time. And here's the really uncomfortable part. This model thrives on instability. Calm doesn't generate engagement. Resolution doesn't keep people tuned in. But constant friction, that's gold. So when journalists blur the line and become participants, they're not just breaking ethics, they're locking in a feedback loop where chaos feeds coverage and coverage feeds chaos. Nobody ever stands up in a newsroom and says, "Let's de-escalate tonight," because de-escalation doesn't monetize. So when people ask, "Why does this keep happening?" that's your answer. It's not a glitch. It's a system that rewards narrative over truth and activism over restraint. And until that incentive structure changes, you're going to keep seeing reporters with press badges in the crowd, and the crowd acting like they're untouchable because the story's already been written. Artie, the scary part isn't that people don't trust the media anymore, it's that the media doesn't seem to care. What happens when the audience finally stops playing along altogether?
That's the moment we're standing on right now, Daniel. The point where people don't just distrust the media, they disconnect from it entirely. And when that happens, the media doesn't lose power quietly. It loses authority suddenly. Because once the audience believes the story is already written before the event even happens, they stop listening for facts and start bracing for impact. That's how you end up with parallel realities, not just different opinions, but different versions of what actually happened. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When the press abandons restraint, somebody else fills the void. Not always responsibly, not always accurately. Independent creators, rumor mills, raw footage with zero context, all of it rushes in to replace what used to be filtered through professional standards. The media keeps telling itself it's holding power accountable, but what it's really doing is vacating the middle, and the middle is where stability lives. So I want to bring in Skylar here because this conversation can't just be one-sided if we're being honest about it. Skylar, from a progressive perspective, some people argue that journalists have to be embedded, emotionally present, even activist adjacent, because traditional neutrality protected power for too long. Do you see journalists participating in protests as a necessary correction? Or do you worry it undermines credibility and makes real reform harder to achieve?
I get why this is happening, and I want to be honest about that first. Because brushing it off as pure corruption misses something real. A lot of journalists genuinely believe neutrality failed, that standing back, quoting both sides, and pretending power dynamics don't exist allowed abuses to go unchecked for decades. From that perspective, being present, embedded, even emotionally invested feels like doing the right thing, not crossing a line. To them, it's less activism and more refusing to be complicit through silence. But here's where I break with how far it's gone. Intent doesn't erase consequence. Even if a reporter believes they're standing up for justice, the moment they chant, march, or visibly align with one side, they lose the ability to be trusted by anyone outside that bubble. And reform that only convinces people who already agree with you isn't reform. It's reinforcement. If the goal is accountability, you actually need credibility with people who are skeptical, uncomfortable, or opposed. Otherwise, you're just preaching while things keep getting worse. What worries me most is that this blurring doesn't just undermine journalism. It backfires on the causes journalists think they're helping. When coverage looks coordinated, when footage feels selective, when emotion replaces verification, it gives opponents an easy out. They stop engaging with the substance and focus on the bias. And that lets real issues, police accountability, civil rights, systemic failures, get dismissed as media theater. That's not progress. That's losing ground. So yeah, I understand why some journalists feel driven to cross that line. But if the press becomes just another activist faction, then it stops being a bridge and becomes another barricade. And once that happens, nobody's listening anymore. They're just yelling past each other.
This is the crossroads we're at. Not left versus right, not protester versus police, but truth versus narrative. When journalists abandon restraint and step into the story they're supposed to document, they don't just lose credibility, they lose their purpose. And once that happens, the public isn't misinformed by accident, it's misled by design. Because here's the reality. A society can survive disagreement, but it cannot survive a collapse of shared facts. When people stop believing the referee is neutral, they stop playing by the rules. They stop trusting institutions. They stop trusting each other. And the media doesn't get to act shocked when that mistrust turns into anger, escalation, and chaos, especially when they helped light the fuse. If journalists want to advocate, fine, say it out loud, own it, drop the mask, but don't demand the authority of objectivity while behaving like activists. You don't get both. And until that line is restored, or at least honestly acknowledged, misinformation won't just spread, it will keep getting people hurt. That's not hyperbole. That's where we are.
Before we wrap, quick shout out to the Data and Dissonance merch store, because supporting independent voices matters now more than ever. We've got the I Support ICE shirt. New millennial and Gen Z designs just dropped. Hats, hoodies, mugs, stickers, all built to back free speech and independent media. Every purchase helps keep this show independent, unscripted, and unowned. Data and Dissonance at printify.me.
We're living in a moment where people don't just disagree on solutions, they disagree on reality itself. And that didn't happen overnight. It happened because the institutions that were supposed to slow things down, add context, and tell the truth without fear or favor decided that impact mattered more than accuracy. When journalism crossed the line into activism, it didn't just pick a side. It abandoned the role that made it valuable in the first place. And here's the hard truth nobody in a newsroom wants to say out loud. You don't build trust by telling people what to think. You build it by showing them what happened, even when it's messy, inconvenient, or doesn't fit a narrative. The moment the press decided the audience couldn't be trusted to draw its own conclusions, it guaranteed the backlash we're seeing now. People don't feel informed anymore. They feel managed, and managed people eventually push back. That's why shows like this exist. Not because we claim to have all the answers, but because we're willing to ask the questions that make powerful institutions uncomfortable. We're willing to say, hold on, or that doesn't line up, and actually sit in that tension instead of papering it over with slogans. If the media wants to advocate, fine, but honesty demands they label it as such. Because opinion pretending to be fact is more dangerous than opinion standing on its own. So as you move through the rest of your day, don't just ask what you're being shown. Ask who benefits from the way it's being framed. Look for the missing context. Look for what's just outside the camera frame. And remember, skepticism isn't cynicism, it's responsibility. That's it for today. This is Data and Dissonance. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Today's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. If you like your fiction grounded in realism, intelligence work, and the kind of truths that don't always make the headlines, start with The Covenant Protocol, where a former intelligence operator uncovers a covert framework operating just beneath public view. Continue with The Prophet Directive, where global pressure, faith, power, and politics collide in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar. And now available, Black Echo Rising, the latest release where the consequences of silence, misinformation, and unchecked authority finally come due. These aren't fantasy villains or cartoon conspiracies. They're stories inspired by real-world systems, real-world incentives, and the uncomfortable reality of how power actually moves. You can find all 3 books on Amazon, available now in digital and print. Supporting the series helps support this show. Independent, reader-backed, and unfiltered. Because the truth doesn't always come with a warning label.